The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Virginia Pritchard finally walked to the edge of her claim and stood there like a woman who had already made up her mind about something she hadn't yet admitted to herself. It was the autumn of 1878, and the Kansas plains had turned the color of old bone under the gray sky. The grasslands rolled out in every direction, flat and indifferent, the way they always had and always would, long after Virginia and everyone she had ever known were buried beneath them. She stood at the northeastern boundary marker, a wooden post she and her husband Thomas had driven into the earth together with a maul and 2 sets of blistered hands, and she let the rain soak through her wool coat without caring much about it. The post had begun to lean. Everything out here began to lean eventually. The wind saw to that. She was 31 years old. She had dark auburn hair that she kept pinned back in a practical knot at the nape of her neck, and she had green eyes that people sometimes described as sharp, though what they meant by that was that she noticed things other people let pass. She was not a small woman, nor a fragile one. Her hands were rough from the work of farming, her shoulders broad from carrying water buckets through 4 seasons of brutal weather, and the lines around her eyes had deepened in the 7 months since Thomas Pritchard had been thrown from his horse and broken his neck on a January morning so cold the tears had frozen on Virginia's face before she could wipe them away. Thomas had been 43 years old when he died. They had been married for 9 years. They had built this claim from nothing, 160 acres under the Homestead Act, filed in 1872, the land rough and unbroken when they first arrived from Ohio with a wagon, a mule, 2 crates of provisions, and the kind of hope that young people carry before the prairie teaches them what hope costs. They had survived grasshopper plagues and drought and a fire that took their first sod house down to ash in the spring of 1874. They had built again. They had planted again. Virginia had suffered 2 miscarriages in the early years, and those losses had sat quiet and unspoken between them like stones at the bottom of a well. But they had endured. That was the word people used out here. Not thrived, not flourished. Endured. And now Thomas was gone, and Virginia had been enduring alone, and the rain was coming down in gray sheets across the Kansas sky, and she was standing at the edge of her claim thinking that perhaps she had endured enough. Her sister Clara lived in Columbus, Ohio. Clara had written 3 letters since Thomas's death, each one a little more insistent than the last, each one describing in careful, loving detail all the reasons why Virginia should abandon the claim, sell what could be sold, and come home to a place where a woman was not required to fight the earth itself just to eat. The letters were sitting on the table inside the soddy, weighted down by a smooth river stone Thomas had carried in his pocket for luck. Virginia had not answered any of them, but she had read them until the paper was soft along the fold lines. She was thinking about the 3rd letter now, standing in the rain. Clara had written, "There is nothing to prove out there anymore, Ginny. Thomas is gone. The land does not know your name and does not care about your suffering. Come home." Virginia stared at the leaning fence post. She thought about the 160 acres behind her, the dormant fields, the hay stored in the lean-to, the 2 remaining cows, the horse, the chickens that had survived the summer. She thought about the mortgage note held by the bank in Dodge City, still 2 years from being clear. She thought about the feel of Thomas's hand on her shoulder on a cold morning, the specific weight and warmth of it, and how no amount of Ohio comfort was going to give that back to her. She had not cried in 2 months. She thought maybe she was done with crying for a while. The rain intensified, drumming against the brim of her hat, running in cold rivulets down the back of her neck. She wrapped her arms around herself and looked west, the direction from which all weather came out here, the direction from which everything came, and she thought, I could leave. I could leave tomorrow. I could write Clara tonight. She had almost completed the thought, had nearly resolved it into a decision, when she heard the sound of hooves on the wet ground coming from the direction of the eastern road. She turned. The horse was a dark roan, and the man riding it was tall in the saddle in the particular way of men who had spent years on horseback, their bodies accommodating the animal's movement without effort or thought. He was riding at a steady pace, not rushing, not the gallop of someone carrying urgent news, just a man moving through the rain with a destination in mind. He wore a long canvas duster coat that had turned dark with water, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the weather. As he drew closer, Virginia could see that he was leading a second horse, a gray, by a rope. He slowed when he saw her standing at the fence post, and he brought his horse to a stop about 30 feet away, which was the polite distance for a stranger. He pushed his hat back slightly, as if that would help him see her better through the rain. "Good afternoon," he said. His voice was low, even, neither too familiar nor too cold. "I apologize for the intrusion. I am looking for the Harker homestead. I was told it lies about 2 miles north of the creek crossing, but I have clearly miscalculated somewhere." Virginia looked at him steadily. Strangers were not uncommon on the Kansas plains. Most of them were harmless drifters, cattlemen, surveyors, men moving between towns. She had learned to read the difference between a man who was trouble and a man who was merely lost, and this one had the look of the latter. His horse was well kept, his tack in good repair, and he had stopped at a polite distance without being asked to. "The Harker place is about a mile north," she said. "You pass the east turnoff about a quarter mile back. There's a split oak at the junction, hard to miss in daylight, but this weather makes everything look the same." "It surely does," he agreed. He paused, looking at her standing in the rain with what she imagined must be some confusion. "Forgive me, but are you all right, ma'am? You appear to have been standing in this rain for some considerable time." Virginia looked down at herself. Her coat was saturated. Her boots were covered in mud. She probably looked like a woman who had lost her mind, standing alone at a fence post in the pouring rain in the middle of the afternoon. "I was thinking," she said. "That requires standing in the rain?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that was not quite amusement but was related to it, a gentle quality, curious rather than mocking. "Sometimes it does," she said. He considered this, and to his credit he did not push the matter. He reached up and touched the brim of his hat. "I appreciate the directions. I hope your thinking goes well, ma'am." He gathered his reins and began to turn his horse, and Virginia, without quite understanding why, heard herself say, "There is coffee on the stove if you need to warm up before you ride on." The man turned back toward her. He looked at her for a long moment, the rain falling between them, and then he said, "I would be grateful for that, thank you." His name was Cecil Carver. She learned this when he introduced himself at her door, hat in hand, water streaming from the brim. He was 37 years old, she would discover later, with a lean, weathered face and dark eyes set under heavy brows, and a jaw that looked like it had been cut with a carpenter's straight edge. He had a scar along his left cheekbone, a small one, silver-white against the tan of his skin. That she would eventually learn came from a barbed wire incident on a Texas ranch 8 years prior. He was not a handsome man in the polished, arranged way of men in portrait photographs, but he had the kind of face that held your attention, that offered the impression of a great deal of thought going on beneath the surface. He wiped his boots carefully on the mat she had placed outside the door, a mat that Thomas had woven from old grain sacking, another small thing she could not look at without feeling a catch in her chest, and he came inside the soddy and stood without presuming to sit until she gestured to the chair near the stove. The interior of Virginia's soddy was modest but not sparse. The walls were whitewashed over the packed earth, and she had hung a few of Thomas's drawings there. He had been a surprisingly skilled draftsman, working in pencil on whatever paper he could find, along with a small calendar from a feed company in Wichita and a shelf that held her books. A Bible, a collection of Tennyson's poems, a medical guide, and 3 volumes of natural history that Thomas had ordered from a catalog in Kansas City. The kitchen end of the room held the iron stove, a plank table, and 2 chairs. The sleeping end was partitioned off by a curtain of heavy canvas. Everything was clean. Virginia had few virtues she claimed for herself, but cleanliness was one of them. Cecil Carver looked around the room with the quiet, respectful attention of a man who understood that a person's home was their most honest self-portrait. "This is a fine place," he said, and he meant it. She could hear that. "It is a good soddy," Virginia said, pouring coffee into a tin cup. "It keeps the wind out better than wood does. Thomas always said that." She set the cup on the table in front of him, and he wrapped both hands around it, warming them. "Thomas is your husband." "Was," she said. "He passed in January." Cecil was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry," he said, in the way that people said it when they meant it rather than just when they were required to by courtesy. "Thank you," Virginia said. She poured a cup for herself and sat across the table from him, because she was not a woman who hovered near stoves while guests sat alone, and because she was curious about him in a way that surprised her a little. "What is your business with the Harkers?" she asked. It was a direct question, but out here directness was not rudeness. Indirectness was a luxury of cities where people had the time to work their way around to things. "I am delivering the gray horse," Cecil said, nodding toward the window in the direction where he had tied both animals under the lean-to at her invitation. "It belongs to a man named Ed Harker. Or it did belong to a man named Ed Harker. He won it from me in a card game in Dodge City about 3 weeks ago, then had the misfortune to break his leg the following morning falling down the hotel stairs and could not make the ride home himself, so he paid me to deliver it." Virginia raised an eyebrow slightly. "That is an unusual occupation." "It is only a temporary one," Cecil said. He turned the coffee cup slowly in his hands. "I have been working as a ranch hand and occasionally as a cattle driver. I came up from Texas this past spring. I am looking for land." "There is land," Virginia said. "There is land in every direction you can look. Most of it will try to kill you." Cecil looked at her, and there was that almost amusement again, that careful, contained thing. "So I have heard," he said. "I have also heard that it is worth it." "Sometimes," Virginia said. They sat in silence for a moment, the rain pattering against the small window, the stove ticking and clicking with its comfortable heat. Virginia was aware that this was the most she had spoken to another human being in 3 weeks, since her neighbor Della Morrow had ridden over to bring a jar of preserved plums and stayed for an afternoon. She had not realized until this moment how much she had been carrying the silence around with her like a coat made of stone. "Where do you come from originally?" she asked. The question was personal, but so was the weather, and so was the fact that she had asked a stranger in off the road. "Virginia originally," he said, and then he looked up and must have registered the change in her expression because he said, "Pardon, did I say something wrong?" "No," she said, "that is my name, Virginia, Virginia Pritchard." Cecil looked at her for a moment, and then he did something she had not expected. He laughed, not loudly, not inappropriately, just a single quiet laugh that crinkled the corners of his dark eyes. "Well," he said, "that is a coincidence that seems almost too neat for real life." "It is just a name," Virginia said, but she found that she was almost smiling too, which was a strange and unfamiliar feeling after 7 months of winter in her chest. Cecil Carver drank his coffee and dried out by her stove, and then he rode north to deliver the gray horse to the Harker family, as he had been paid to do. Virginia watched him go from the window, his tall figure disappearing into the gray curtain of rain, and she thought that was the end of it. A stranger passing through. The West was full of them. But the thought she had been thinking at the fence post, the thought about leaving, about Clara's letters, about Ohio, that thought did not resolve itself the way she had expected it to. It sat unfinished in the back of her mind like a sentence with no period, open and waiting. She cooked her supper, fed her animals, and sat at the table with Clara's letters spread out before her and a blank sheet of paper and a pen. She sat there for a long time, and then she folded the letters away and put the blank paper back in the drawer without writing anything on it. Cecil Carver returned the following morning. She was in the middle of mending a harness when she heard his horse in the yard, and she came to the door with the leather still in her hands and found him standing there with his hat off, looking a little uncertain for the first time since she had seen him. "I hope I am not intruding," he said. "I delivered the horse last evening and spent the night at the Harker place. Mrs. Harker mentioned that you have been working this land alone since January." Virginia looked at him steadily. "She mentioned that, did she?" "She did," Cecil said. "She also mentioned that your south fence is down in 3 places and that you have not been able to get the winter wheat in because you are short a man for the plowing. I have no destination requiring me urgently at the present moment, and I know how to plow a field and mend a fence. I thought I might offer my assistance if it would not be unwelcome." Virginia studied him for a long time. She was not a woman who accepted charity easily, and she was not a woman who let strangers onto her claim without being clear about the terms. She had managed alone for 7 months with a combination of stubborn will, the goodwill of neighbors who had their own farms to tend, and a refusal to admit how close she was coming to the edge of what she could sustain by herself. "I pay fair wages," she said, $3 a week and meals." "That is generous," Cecil said. "It is standard," Virginia said. "And I want to be clear, Mr. Carver, that I am a widow living alone, and if you are the kind of man who sees that as an invitation of any kind other than employment, you can ride back the way you came right now and save us both the trouble." Cecil met her eyes without flinching. "Mrs. Pritchard," he said, "I am not that kind of man." She believed him. She was not sure why precisely. She was not a woman given to trusting strangers on the basis of tone and bearing alone, but she believed him. Perhaps it was the directness of his answer, without protest or wounded dignity. Perhaps it was the way he had stood at a polite distance in the rain and not presumed. Perhaps it was simply that she was tired and she needed the fence mended and the wheat put in before the ground froze, and sometimes need was its own kind of judgment. "You can stay in the lean-to," she said. "There is a cot. The roof does not leak. I will have breakfast ready at 6. "Thank you," he said. And he went to tend his horse, and Virginia went back to the harness, and the arrangement began. The first week was entirely practical. Cecil worked with the focused efficiency of a man who had done hard physical labor for most of his life. He mended the south fence in 2 days, replacing the broken posts with timber he cut from the dead cottonwood at the creek bottom, setting them deep against the winter frost heave. He was strong in the straightforward, unconsidered way of men who have not thought about their strength, because it has simply always been there when they needed it. He did not require direction once he had been shown what needed doing. He assessed the situation and he worked, and Virginia found herself watching him sometimes from across the yard in the early morning light, not with any particular feeling she could name, just with the interest of a woman who had been alone for a long time watching someone move through her world. They ate breakfast and supper together at the kitchen table, because Virginia was not going to cook 2 separate meals, and because she was not the kind of woman who made her hired hands eat outside like dogs. These meals were the point of each day where they talked, and the talking began as the practical exchange of 2 people who needed to coordinate their work and gradually, without either of them directing it consciously, became something else. Cecil talked about Texas first, because that was the most recent thing. He had worked 5 years on a cattle ranch outside of San Antonio, driving longhorns north along the Kishom Trail every spring, sleeping under the stars more nights than not, eating trail food and watching the land change as the herds moved north through Oklahoma and into Kansas. He talked about it the way men talk about hard work they loved, with a kind of rueful affection, acknowledging the brutality of it without romanticizing it, and without quite being able to disguise how alive it had made him feel. "Why did you leave?" Virginia asked one evening over a meal of salt pork and cornbread and the last of the summer's canned tomatoes. Cecil turned his fork between his fingers. "The owner of the ranch died. His son took over and changed the operation. He was not a man I could work for." Virginia understood without asking further. There were men you could work for and men you could not, and the difference between them was usually a matter of how they treated the people who worked for them. "And before Texas?" she asked. "Virginia," he said, and then that quiet, almost amusement again. "The state, I mean. I grew up in the Shenandoah Valley. My father had a small farm there. My mother's family had been in the valley for 4 generations." He paused. "The war changed things." He did not specify which war, because in 1878 there was only one war that needed no specification, the one that had ended 13 years ago but whose shadow still fell across everything like a mountain blocking the sun. "We came through it," he said. "But the farm could not sustain what came after. I was 17 when it ended and there was nothing to do but go west, the way everyone was doing." Virginia was quiet for a moment, thinking about that. 17 and going west with whatever could be salvaged from a war's aftermath. She knew something about salvage. "I came from Ohio," she said. "Thomas and I both. His family had land there, but there were 4 sons and only so much land to divide. The Homestead Act came along and he said, 'Why divide what your father built when you could go build your own?' And I believed him." "Do you regret it?" Cecil asked. He asked it quietly, without any implication that she should or should not. Virginia thought about Thomas's pencil drawings on the whitewashed walls. She thought about the plum tree they had planted together in 1875 that had finally given fruit this past summer, small tart plums that she had stood in the orchard eating straight from the branch because she had been so pleased by them. She thought about the lean post at the northeast corner of the claim. "No," she said. "I regret that he is gone. I do not regret the place." Cecil looked at her, and there was something in his expression that she could not quite read, something careful and private, but the look lingered a moment longer than the exchange required before he looked back down at his plate. The wheat went in during the second week. The soil was cold and heavy, and the work was slow, Cecil driving the plow and Virginia walking the furrows behind him, pressing the seed corn down with her hands the way she had always done it, the way Thomas had taught her, the way his father had taught him. They worked from first light to last light, and by the end of the third day, the south field was planted, and Virginia's back was a single column of aching fire, and Cecil had a blister on his right hand, the size of a silver dollar, that she dressed with lard and cotton cloth at the kitchen table while he held his hand still and did not complain about it. She was aware of his hand in hers. The warmth of it, the roughness of the palm. She worked quickly and efficiently and did not look up at his face while she worked because she did not want to see whatever expression might be there, and she did not know what expression might be on her own face, and some things were better navigated by looking at the task at hand. "Thank you," he said when she had finished. "You work hard," she said, tying off the cloth. "It would be a waste to let your hand go infected." "I appreciate the practical reasoning," he said, and there was warmth in it, real warmth, not just the almost amusement she had catalogued before. She let go of his hand and moved back to the stove to check the pot. The town of Millard's Creek was 6 miles east, and on the second Saturday of his stay, Cecil rode in for provisions they had agreed were needed and returned in the late afternoon with flour, coffee, a tin of molasses, nails, and, somewhat unexpectedly, a small parcel wrapped in brown paper that he set on the table without explanation. Virginia looked at the parcel, then at him. "It is nothing significant," he said, hanging up his duster. "I saw it in the general store and thought of you." She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a book, a small, slim volume of poetry by Emily Dickinson, the collected poems that had been published in various journals, gathered and bound. Virginia had heard of Dickinson but had never read her, and she turned the book over in her hands with the focused attention she gave to all objects she found genuinely interesting. "How did you think of me when you saw this?" she asked. The question was direct, the way all her questions were, but there was something underneath it that was not just curiosity. Cecil poured water from the pitcher into the basin and washed his hands, taking his time about answering. "You have books," he said. "And you read them. I can tell because the spines on the ones you have are worn from being opened many times. Most people out here have a Bible and nothing else. You have Tennyson and 3 books about natural history. He dried his hands. It seemed like something you would want to read. Virginia looked at the book for another moment, and then she set it carefully on the shelf next to the Tennyson. "Thank you," she said, in a voice that she managed to keep practical even though something in her chest had gone briefly warm and then contracted, the way a hand opens and then closes over something it wants to hold. That night after supper, she sat at the table and read 3 pages of Emily Dickinson and felt the strange, piercing sensation of a poet reaching across the years and the distance, and saying the exact thing she had not known how to say herself. She read, "After great pain, a formal feeling comes." She read, "The nerves sit ceremonious like tombs." She set the book down and looked at Thomas's drawings on the wall, a careful rendering of the creek bottom willows, a sketch of the barn they had built together in 1876, and she let herself feel the grief of it cleanly and simply, without the layer of numbness she had been wearing over it for months, and it hurt like a wound being cleaned, which is to say it hurt in a way that felt distantly like healing. In the 3rd week, a complication arrived in the form of a man named Darnell Good. Darnell Good was the owner of the largest cattle operation in the county, which operated out of a ranch south of Millard's Creek, and he had been expressing interest in Virginia's 160 acres since shortly after Thomas's death. Not personal interest in Virginia herself, but interest in the land, which sat at a favorable location relative to his grazing operations and the creek water rights that came with it. He had sent 2 letters already, offering what he called a fair price, which was the price of a man who expected you to take what he offered because you had no alternative. He arrived on a Tuesday morning while Cecil was mending the roof of the chicken coop, riding up with 2 men behind him, as if he were conducting a business meeting rather than calling uninvited on a widow. He was a heavy man in his early 50s, with the confident manner of someone who had not heard the word no from anyone who mattered to him in a very long time. He wore good boots and a heavy coat, and an expression of settled authority. Virginia came out to meet him in the yard, drying her hands on her apron. "Mrs. Pritchard," he said, tipping his hat in a minimal way, "I believe you have received my correspondence. I thought we might discuss the matter in person, given that you have not seen fit to respond." "Good morning, Mr. Good," Virginia said. "I did receive your letters. I did not respond because my answer has not changed. The claim is not for sale." Good looked down at her from his horse with the expression of a man hearing something he had decided was temporary rather than real. "Now, Mrs. Pritchard, let's be reasonable. A woman alone, this late in the season, carrying a debt note on a piece of ground that's going to fight you every step of the way, I am offering you a chance to settle clean and move on with your life. I am offering more than fair value." "I know what you are offering," Virginia said, "and I know what fair value is, and I know the difference between those 2 things, Mr. Good." From up on the chicken coop roof, Cecil had gone still. Virginia did not look at him, but she was aware of him the way you are aware of a steady thing. Good's expression tightened. "I have a right to make you an offer, and I have a right to decline it," Virginia said, "which I am doing, plainly and without ambiguity, for the 3rd time. This land is mine, the debt will be clear in 2 years, and it is not going to be sold to you at any price, because it is my home and I have no intention of leaving it." There it was. The thought she had been standing in the rain trying to finish at the fence post, the thought Cecil Carver had interrupted before she could resolve it in the wrong direction. She had not realized until this moment, saying it out loud to a man who wanted to take it from her, that the thought had resolved itself after all. Somewhere in the 3 weeks of planting wheat and mending fences and eating supper across a table from a man who listened when she talked and thought of her when he was in a bookshop, she had made her decision. She was not going to Ohio. She was going to stay. Good looked at her for a long, tight moment. Then he looked over at Cecil, who had come down from the roof and was standing near the corner of the coop, his arms loose at his sides, watching. "You have hired help now," Good observed. the two words carrying a slight weight of implication. "I have an employee," Virginia said, "which is a common and respectable arrangement on a working farm, as you yourself must know given the number of men you employ." Good sat on his horse for another moment, and then he pulled the animal around. "My offer stands," he said without looking back. "When you change your mind, Mrs. Pritchard." "I will not change it," she said. She stood in the yard watching them ride away until they were small figures on the flat horizon. Then she turned and found Cecil still standing by the corner of the coop, looking at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. "You did not need me to say anything," he said. "It was not quite a question." "No," she said, "I did not, but I appreciated you being there." He nodded slowly, and she thought she saw something shift in his expression, some private satisfaction that he did not announce. She went back inside to start the midday meal. The problem with Darnell Good did not end with that morning, because Darnell Good was not a man accustomed to the end of things happening on other people's schedules. 2 weeks after his visit, Virginia rode into Millard's Creek to conduct some business at the bank, and found herself in a conversation with the bank manager, a thin, nervous man named Pritchard, who informed her with much apologetic throat-clearing that her mortgage note had been purchased by a third party. Virginia sat across the desk from Pritchard and kept her face very still. "Who is the third party?" she asked. Pritchard looked at the papers on his desk. "A Mr. Darnell Good," he said. Virginia was quiet for a moment. She was very good at being quiet. "What does that mean for the terms?" she asked. "The terms remain the same," Pritchard said. "The note is due at the original date. The purchase simply means that your payments will now be directed to Mr. Good rather than to this institution." "And if the note cannot be paid," Virginia said, "Mr. Good forecloses." "That is the standard arrangement, yes," Pritchard said, and had the grace to look uncomfortable about it. Virginia rode home in a controlled fury, which was the only kind of fury she permitted herself. She was not a woman who raged out loud where it would accomplish nothing and only exhaust her. She turned the problem over and examined it as she rode, the way you examine a knot in a piece of leather, looking for the place where pulling one strand would loosen the rest. Cecil was splitting wood in the yard when she rode in, and he must have read something in her bearing because he set down the maul and waited. She told him what Pritchard had told her. She sat on the fence rail of the horse pen and told him plainly, the way she said everything. Cecil was quiet for a moment, processing the mechanics of it. "How much remains on the note?" he asked. $120, Virginia said. "Payable in 2 years. That is not the problem. The problem is what he does between now and then. He can make your life difficult without technically violating the terms," Cecil said. He was not asking, he understood how these arrangements worked. "Yes," Virginia said. "He can find technical violations. He can pressure suppliers not to extend credit. He can do a dozen things that are not illegal but that squeeze." She looked at the flat horizon to the south, the direction of Good's ranch. "He has done it before to other people. The Morrows almost lost their place 3 years ago because of a similar arrangement with a different man." Cecil picked up the maul again, turned it in his hands, set it down. "What do you want to do?" he asked. It was the right question. Not what she should do, not what he thought she should do. What did she want to do? "I want to get through the winter, make the spring planting, and find a way to pay the note off early so that he no longer holds it," she said. "I have some savings, not enough but some. And the wheat, if the spring is kind, should bring something at market." "What would make the difference?" Cecil asked. Virginia thought for a moment. $60, $70, that would do it combined with what I have." Cecil was quiet, and Virginia looked at him and found him looking back at her with a very direct expression. "I have money saved," he said, "from the Texas work. I was going to use it toward land, but—" "No," Virginia said before he could finish. The word came out sharply, more sharply than she intended. "I am not going to take your savings, Mr. Carver. That is not a thing I am going to do." "I know you are not," he said, patient. "I was going to say that I have money saved, and I am willing to invest it in this operation in exchange for a fair portion of the spring wheat profit, a business arrangement." Virginia looked at him for a long time. She was aware that this was a different thing from what he had first appeared to be offering, and she was also aware that the line between a business arrangement and other kinds of arrangements was in this situation fairly blurred. "Why?" she asked. "You could use that money toward your own land. Why spend it here?" Cecil turned the maul in his hands again. It seemed to be something he did when he was choosing his words carefully. "Because this is a good piece of ground," he said. "Because the wheat is in and it is going to be a good yield if the winter is not too cruel. Because the arrangement makes financial sense." He paused. "And because I do not like Darnell Good." Virginia almost smiled. "That is a comprehensive answer," she said. "It is an honest one," he said. She agreed to the arrangement. She wrote it down, the terms clean and specific, because she was a woman who believed in the protection of paper and ink. And she signed it and he signed it, and she kept a copy in the tin box under the floorboard where she kept her important documents. The winter came hard and early. By mid-November, the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that made the air hurt, and Virginia was grateful for every cord of wood Cecil had split and stacked against the south wall of the soddy, a wall of split cottonwood and elm that stood 4 feet high and 12 feet long, and was, she thought, one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen, in the specific way that useful things are beautiful when you need them. They settled into the rhythms of winter. There was less outdoor work to be done, which meant more time in the kitchen, more time at the table in the evenings with the lamp burning and the stove putting out its steady warmth. Virginia read her way through the Dickinson twice and started on the Tennyson again. Cecil had brought 2 books of his own in his saddlebag, a battered copy of a Dickens novel, Bleak House, and a field guide to the flora of the Great Plains that he had apparently been working his way through for some time, given the number of pages with notes in the margins in his small, precise handwriting. She noticed his handwriting by accident one evening when she picked up the field guide to look at a passage he had mentioned, and she found herself reading his marginal notes, small, careful observations, things like "see also creek bottom variety," and much more common than text suggests in this region, and one that said simply, "Remarkable, July 4th," next to an entry about a blue wildflower she had herself noticed in the summer pasture without knowing its name. "You know plants," she said, looking up at him. "I know the ones out here reasonably well," he said, without looking up from Bleak House. It started as practical knowledge, which ones your horses can eat, which ones will make a cow sick, which ones you can eat yourself if you are in an emergency situation. But then it became interesting on its own terms. "Thomas used to say that about drawing," Virginia said. "He started drawing the land because he wanted to understand how it was laid out, the contours, the drainage, and then it became interesting for its own sake." Cecil looked up now. "He was good at it," he said, his gaze moving to the drawings on the wall. "The creek bottom willows especially. The light in that one is very well observed." Virginia looked at the drawing. Thomas had done it on a summer evening in 1876, the willows catching the low sun off the water, rendered in pencil with a patience and precision she had always loved. "Yes," she said. He saw things very carefully. They were quiet for a moment, both of them looking at Thomas's drawing, and it was the first time Virginia had experienced the memory of her husband in the presence of another person, and had felt it as something shared rather than something she had to protect and carry alone. "Tell me about him," Cecil said. "If you want to." She did want to. She talked about Thomas for almost an hour that night, about the Ohio farm, and the way he had planned their westward journey with the same careful attention he gave to his drawings, laying out the route and the provisions and the contingencies on a long sheet of paper at the kitchen table, while his family looked on with varying degrees of skepticism. About the first winter in the soddy when they had both been so cold and so miserable, and so in love with what they were building that neither of them would have admitted to the misery. About the grasshopper plague of 1874 that had stripped the fields in 2 days, and how Thomas had stood in the ruined field afterward and been quiet for a long time, and then had said, "Well, we know the soil is good, because look what grew in it before they ate it." Cecil listened. He did not fill the silences with his own stories or his own reassurances. He simply listened, and Virginia found that this was the most useful thing anyone had done for her in a very long time. "He sounds like a man worth grieving," Cecil said when she had finished. "He was," Virginia said. "And you are not done grieving him," Cecil said. "It was not a question or a judgment, just an observation." "No," Virginia said, "but I am learning to carry it differently." Cecil looked at her for a moment with those dark eyes, and she looked back, and something passed between them that was not quite named yet, but was present and real in the warm lamplight of the Kansas winter. The worst of the winter came in January, the anniversary month, which Virginia had been dreading from October onward. It arrived the way she had feared it would, with a particular quality of cold gray light that reminded her of the morning Thomas had ridden out and not come back, the light of those first hours before she had known there was anything wrong, when the day had still been ordinary. She moved through the first week of January with a careful, controlled grief that she thought she was managing reasonably well until the afternoon of the 14th, which was the exact date of Thomas's death, when she sat down on the floor of the soddy with her back against the bed frame and could not seem to get up for a while. Cecil found her there. He had come in from checking on the animals, and he stopped inside the door and looked at her, and then he came and sat down on the floor next to her, his back against the bed frame too, both of them looking at the stove. He did not say anything. He did not tell her to come sit in a chair, or offer to make tea, or say that Thomas was in a better place, or any of the other things people said to ease their own discomfort in the presence of someone else's grief. He just sat there, his shoulder near hers without quite touching, and the presence of him solid and quiet and entirely without expectation was the most comforting thing she had experienced since January of the previous year. After a long while she said, "A year." "Yes," he said. "It does not feel like a year," she said. "It feels like yesterday and also like a very long time ago simultaneously, which is a strange thing." "I imagine it is," he said. "I would not know exactly. I have not had a loss like that." "You have not been married?" "No," he said. "I came close once, a woman in Texas, but it did not happen, and I think in retrospect that was right for both of us, though it did not feel right at the time." Virginia turned her head slightly to look at his profile. He was staring at the stove, his expression thoughtful and private in equal measure. "What happened?" she asked, and then, "You do not have to tell me." "It is not a dramatic story," he said. "She wanted a different life than the one I was living. She was not wrong to want it. She married a man in San Antonio who had a house and a business and a future that did not involve being gone 5 months of the year on a cattle drive. Last I heard they were doing well." "And you?" Virginia said. "Were you all right?" He thought about this for a moment, genuinely thought about it rather than producing the automatic fine that men usually offered. "I was lonely," he said, "for a while. And then I got used to it, and then it became so normal that I stopped recognizing it. Until I was sitting at someone's table eating supper and talking in the evenings, and realized I had forgotten what it was like not to be lonely." Virginia looked at the stove. Her heart was doing something irregular and quiet. "Cecil," she said, and then she stopped because she was not sure what she had been going to say. "Virginia," he said, and the way he said it was not the same as the way he said everything else. It had a particular weight, a particular care, as if her name were something to be handled gently. She turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, and they were very close in the way that two people sitting on the floor with their backs against a bed frame inevitably are, and the lamplight was doing its soft, unreasonable work. And Virginia thought with a sudden clarity that she had not felt frightened of anything in a very long time because there had been nothing left to be frightened of, and she was frightened now, which meant that something had become valuable to her again. She looked away first. She pressed her palms flat against the floor and stood up, and Cecil stood up too without hurry or embarrassment, the way a man stands up from a floor who has done nothing requiring embarrassment. "I will start supper," Virginia said. "I will bring in more wood," Cecil said. They went about their separate tasks, and neither of them mentioned what had not quite been said, but it was there in the room with them all through supper and all through the evening, as present and warm as the stove. February blew in with a week-long blizzard that kept them both inside for 4 days straight. Virginia had experienced Kansas blizzards before and had made her preparations: extra fuel, extra provisions. The animals crowded into the linta with extra hay. But 4 days in a small soddy with another person when something unspoken had been sitting between you for weeks was an exercise in careful navigation. They played cards by the stove in the evenings, a game of 7-card rummy that Virginia had learned from Thomas and taught to Cecil, and they were evenly matched in a way that made the games interesting. They talked for hours, moving through subjects with the ease of people who had discovered that they were genuinely curious about the same things: the mechanics of the Great Plains weather, the literature they had both read, the history of the land and what it had been before it was claimed and fenced, which was a subject that occupied both of them more than most. "The Arapaho and the Cheyenne were here before us," Virginia said one evening, looking out the frosted window at the white nothing of the blizzard. "Before any of it was claims and fences and courthouse deeds. This land we have been planting wheat and people lived on it and moved through it, and it was their home." "Yes," Cecil said, without the reflexive defensive dismissal she had encountered from other people when she said things like this. "The government took it," she said. "One treaty after another, each one smaller than the last, and the army enforcing them when it suited Washington and disregarding them when it did not. And now here we are, homesteading on land that was taken from people who had been here for generations." She paused. "I think about that sometimes. I do not know what to do about it. I am one woman on one piece of ground, and I did not make the policy, but I think about it." "I think about it too," Cecil said. "I drove cattle up through Indian territory on the trail, and the men I worked with mostly thought of it as empty land or as the Indians' problem to solve, not theirs. But it was not empty. It was never empty." "No," Virginia said. "It never was." They were quiet together with that thought, which was a different kind of shared silence from the comfortable domestic kind, more somber, more honest, the silence of two people acknowledging something large and troubling that they cannot fix but refuse to pretend is not there. On the 3rd day of the blizzard, they were reading in comfortable, companionable silence when Cecil said, without looking up from Bleak House, "Virginia, I would like to be honest with you about something." She put down the Dickinson. "All right," she said. He closed his book and set it on the table. He looked at her with the direct, steady gaze that she had come to associate with him saying something he had been turning over carefully for a long time. "I did not stay on purely for the business arrangement," he said. "I want you to know that. I stayed because I wanted to be here, because this place and the person in it became the place I most wanted to be. And I think you deserve to know that plainly because you are a woman who deserves plain dealing." Virginia looked at him. Her hands were very still on the book in her lap. "I know," she said. "I suspected, possibly from before the business arrangement." And he said, one word quiet as a held breath. "And I am still deciding what I think about it," she said, "which is the most honest answer I can give you." "That is enough," he said. "I am not in a hurry." He picked up Bleak House again. Virginia picked up the Dickinson. The blizzard howled outside and the stove kept its faith, and the lamp burned steadily between them. The spring came the way it always came to the Kansas plains. In fits and starts, a warm day followed by a bitter one, the ground thawing and then freezing again, the sky unable to make up its mind. But by late March the soil was ready, and the winter wheat had survived under its snow blanket and was pushing through in neat rows of green that Virginia walked along in the early mornings, checking each one the way you check on something precious. Delamaro came to call in April, riding over on a bright morning with her husband Frank and their 3 children crowded into the wagon, bringing a smoked ham and the cheerful social energy of a family that had survived another winter and was celebrating it. Virginia was glad to see them. The Morrows were good people. the kind of neighbors the West produced at its best, practical and generous and uncomplicated in their goodwill. Della was a shrewd observer of human situations. She had noted Cecil's presence at Virginia's farm with the immediate focused attention of a woman who noticed such things, and over the course of the afternoon, she managed to speak to Virginia alone in the kitchen, while the men looked at the wheat fields and Frank Morrow offered Cecil his opinions on spring planting, which Frank Morrow offered to anyone who would stand still long enough to receive them. "He is a good man," Della said, not bothering with preamble, washing a dish at the basin with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had washed thousands of dishes in her life. "He works hard," Virginia said. "That is not what I mean," Della said, looking at her sideways. "I know what you mean," Virginia said. And Della said, Virginia dried a plate carefully. "And I am working on it," she said. Della smiled at the window, not making a project of it. "Good," she said. "That is the right answer." The wheat came in beautifully in June. The June rains were kind that year, not the drowning kind, not the absent kind, but the steady, measured kind that fell 3 nights a week in the right quantities and let the days be clear and warm enough for the crop to build toward the head. Virginia walked her fields in the evenings and felt something that was not exactly joy but was adjacent to it, the satisfaction of work vindicated, of effort turning into something real and golden in the long Kansas light. Cecil was tireless. He had the gift of physical work well applied, the kind of farmer's knowledge that was partly learned and partly instinctive, and Virginia found herself relying on that knowledge more and more, not out of incapacity, but out of the pleasure of shared endeavor, of two minds working on the same problem from different angles, and arriving at better solutions together than either would have reached alone. The harvest began in late June. They worked side by side in the heat, and the work was hard and hot and relentless, and Virginia felt fully alive in a way she had not felt for a long time, the kind of alive that comes from using your body fully in the service of something that matters. By the end of 3 days, the south field was cut, and by the end of a week the north field too, and the grain was in the barn in sacks, and Virginia sat on the fence rail in the evening light and looked at her fields and felt the tears come, not grief this time, but something else, some overflow that had no exact name. Cecil came and sat on the rail beside her. He did not ask what was wrong, because he could see that nothing was wrong. He just sat there, his arm not quite against hers, the evening light golden on the stubble fields. "Thomas would have been proud of this," she said. "Yes," Cecil said. "He would." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the fields, his expression quiet and full, and she thought about the year, the rain at the fence post, the knock at the door, the coffee and the conversations and the winter floor and the book of Dickinson poems and all the small accumulated weight of days that build into something you cannot disassemble or describe, only feel. "Cecil," she said. He turned to look at her. The evening light was doing things to the angles of his face that she had catalogued, without acknowledging the cataloging, many times over the past months. "I have finished deciding," she said. He was very still. "And," he said, the same word, the same quiet as a held breath. She reached out and took his hand. His hand closed around hers, warm, rough, certain, the hand of a man who held things carefully. She looked at his face and found there an expression of such particular, private care that it made her throat tighten. "I do not want you to go," she said. "I have not wanted you to go since approximately the blizzard, if I am being honest. And you know that I am almost always honest." "I know that about you," he said, his voice low and careful. "I love Thomas," she said. "I will always have loved Thomas. That is not going to change or diminish. But I am not going to pretend to you or to myself that I have not, that I do not." She stopped, started again. "This is harder to say plainly than most things." "Then say it however it comes," he said. "I love you," she said. "I did not expect to, and it surprised me, and I thought for a long time that it was too soon or too strange or too complicated. But it is simply true, so I am telling you." Cecil looked at her for a moment, a long, full, private moment, and then he raised their joined hands and pressed his lips to the back of her hand. And it was not the formal gesture it might have looked like to an observer. It was something entirely specific to the two of them, a recognition and a promise all at once. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since you told me that sometimes thinking requires standing in the rain. I did not say so because I did not think it was my place, and because you needed time, and because I was not willing to say it until I was certain you wanted to hear it." "I want to hear it," she said. "Then I am saying it," he said. "I love you, Virginia Pritchard. The farm and the fields and the Dickinson poems and the way you say exactly what you mean, and the way you look at a wheat field in the evening light. All of it. I love all of it." She leaned forward and kissed him, there on the fence rail in the evening light of the Kansas summer, with the stubble fields golden around them and the first star appearing in the east and the warm Kansas wind doing what it always did, which was blow through everything and leave it altered. The wheat sold well at market in Dodge City in mid-July. Virginia and Cecil drove the grain in together, 3 full days on the road with the wagon loaded, and the summer heat pressing down on the plains with its full seasonal authority. Dodge City in the summer of 1878 was a town in its fullest and most complicated expression. The cattle season was at its height, with longhorn herds coming up from Texas and buyers coming down from the eastern packing houses, and the streets were busy with the specific mixture of commerce and danger and human energy that characterized a cattle town at its peak. Virginia conducted her business at the grain exchange with the careful efficiency she brought to all commercial transactions, negotiating a price that was 2 cents per bushel above the first offer because she knew the market rates and was not going to accept less. Cecil stood at her shoulder during the negotiation, not intervening, not directing, simply present and attentive. Afterward, the buyer, a large, red-faced man who had clearly expected an easier transaction, watched them walk away and said, to no one in particular, "That woman knows her numbers." "She does," Cecil said pleasantly, and followed Virginia out. With the wheat money and the savings she had accumulated and the contribution from Cecil, Virginia walked into the office of Darnell Goods' business representative in Dodge City on the second morning of their visit and paid off the remaining note in full. She took the satisfaction of it square and direct, watching the number written in the ledger, taking her receipt, folding it with precise care, and putting it in her coat pocket. On the street outside, Cecil said, "How does that feel?" Virginia thought for a moment. "Like taking a stone out of my boot," she said. "A very large stone that has been in there for 2 years." He laughed, a full, genuine laugh that she had come to love for its rarity and its quality, the laugh of a man who did not laugh easily but meant it entirely when he did. They had supper at a restaurant in Dodge City that evening, a real restaurant, with tablecloths and a menu card, something Virginia had not experienced in years. She wore the good dress she had brought, dark green wool, and pinned her hair up more carefully than usual, and Cecil had put on a clean shirt and jacket, and they sat across a table from each other in the lamplight like two people who had arrived somewhere after a long journey. "I want to ask you something," Cecil said, over the meal. He had been quiet for a few minutes in the particular way that preceded something deliberate. "Ask," Virginia said. "I want to file a homestead claim on the land adjacent to yours, the 80 acres north of the creek, which I understand has been available since the Denton family left in the spring." He turned his fork in his hand. "As a beginning, as something that is mine, that I am building, I have the filing fees." He paused. "And I want to ask if you would, if this is something you might want. I am not handling this as smoothly as I intended." Virginia looked at him with something very close to amusement and something even closer to tenderness. "Cecil Carver," she said. "Are you asking me to marry you?" He put down the fork. "Yes," he said, "that is what I am asking, though I appear to have arrived at it by way of a discussion of adjacent land claims. That is actually a very sensible approach to a marriage proposal in this particular context," Virginia said. "Is it?" he said with the ghost of a smile. "The land matters," she said. What we build on it matters. Asking it that way makes sense to me." She reached across the tablecloth and put her hand on his. "Yes," she said, "that is my answer. Yes to the adjacent claim and yes to the rest of it." He turned his hand under hers and held it. The restaurant around them continued its pleasant noise. The lamplight was warm and golden. Outside, Dodge City was doing what Dodge City did, but in here, in this small circle of light and tablecloth and good food, and the hand that held hers, everything was very settled and clear. They were married in September at the Millards Creek Church, which was a simple white-painted frame building that the community had raised in 1876, and that served also as schoolhouse, meeting hall, and general repository for the social life of the surrounding farms. The Morrows came, and the Harkers, and several other families from the county, whose names Virginia and Cecil had learned over the course of the year through the gradual accumulation of neighborly connection that was the social fabric of the plains. Virginia wore the green wool dress and had Della Morrow arrange her hair, and she carried a small bunch of the wild blue flowers from the creek bottom that Cecil had marked in his field guide with the word remarkable. Cecil wore his good jacket and had his boots polished to a mirror shine, and stood at the front of the church with the expression of a man who cannot quite believe his own good fortune, and is being careful not to disturb it by celebrating too soon. The minister was a young man named Graves who had come out from Pennsylvania the previous year with more enthusiasm than experience, but he read the service well and his sincerity was genuine. And when he said the words of the ceremony, Virginia heard them with a double attention. The immediate presence of this man beside her, this particular quiet strength she had come to trust absolutely, and also the memory of standing in another church 9 years ago with Thomas. The weight of the words the same and the world around them, just as full of possibility and unknown difficulty. She had talked to Cecil about this, about whether it was strange or wrong to feel Thomas's presence in this moment, and he had said, without hesitation, "There is room for everything that is true. There is room for your love for him and your love for me, and for both of them to be real without one diminishing the other." She had thought, not for the first time, that she was marrying a man of extraordinary good sense. She said her vows clearly and without hesitation, looking directly at Cecil Carver's dark eyes in the white church of Millards Creek, and he said his with the same directness, the same absolute absence of doubt, and the minister said the words that made it official, and the room rustled with the particular warmth of people who have gathered to witness something good. After the ceremony there was a celebration at the Morrows' place, fiddle music, and dancing on the packed earth yard, food from a dozen different kitchens, children running between the adults' legs in the September evening. Virginia danced with Cecil to a reel she had not danced since Ohio, and he was a better dancer than she had expected, moving with the same economical competence he brought to everything physical, and she laughed at the surprise of it, and he laughed at her laughing, and the fiddle played. Frank Morrow made a toast, short and heartfelt, and Della Morrow cried a little in the straightforward way she cried, dabbing her eyes without apology. Someone had obtained a bottle of something better than the usual whiskey, and it went around among the men and came back to Frank Morrow by mysterious circuitous route, which Virginia noted and chose not to mention. They rode home in the dark, Virginia and Cecil, the September stars enormous overhead, the kind of clear, sharp night that Kansas delivered sometimes as if apologizing for the summer's heat. The wagon moved through the dark and Virginia sat close to Cecil on the seat and felt the warmth of his arm along hers and listened to the familiar night sounds of the plains, the crickets, the distant coyotes, the creak of the wagon, and thought that this was not the life she had imagined when she was a young woman in Ohio, and it was not the life she had built with Thomas, and it was not the life she had been contemplating ending at a rain-soaked fence post in September of the previous year. It was a new one, built from the ones that had come before, carrying their memory and their shaping, but new in its own right. Virginia Pritchard, who had become Virginia Carver in a white church on a September afternoon, was not starting over. She was continuing, and the continuation was full and present and entirely worth the rain she had stood in. The winter of 1878 to 1879 was gentler than the one before. They were settled now, not just physically settled in the soddy that Cecil had helped expand before the cold came, adding a second room off the east side with a proper plank floor and a new stove, but settled in the particular way of two people who have learned each other's rhythms and no longer have to think about the sharing of a life, who have simply begun to live it. Cecil filed his homestead claim on the north 80 acres in October, which now adjoined Virginia's claim along the creek, and they were in the process of building a proper frame house to stand on the combined property, a project they had planned together through the autumn, with Cecil's careful measurements and Virginia's equally careful opinions about windows and kitchen design and the necessity of a proper pantry. The house would not be finished until spring, but the planning of it was its own kind of pleasure, a conversation that extended across evenings and suppers and early mornings over coffee, the future taking shape in spoken and drawn form before it took shape in wood and stone. Darnell Good made no further overtures about the land. Word had apparently reached him, through the channels by which such things traveled in small communities, that the note was paid and the land was clear and the widow had married a competent man and was not going anywhere. He remained a presence on the southern horizon, a fact of the landscape like the weather, but no longer a threat. Virginia wrote to Clara in Ohio. A long letter, longer than any she had written in years, telling her everything: Thomas's anniversary, the wheat, Cecil, the marriage. She wrote it carefully and honestly, the way she did things, and she sealed it and gave it to the post rider with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has been keeping her sister waiting long enough. Clara's reply came in December, and it was exactly what Virginia had expected: concern and affection, and some hurt at not having been consulted sooner, and a great deal of questions about Cecil, and an ending that said she was glad, genuinely glad, that Virginia had found something good in that hard place, even if she still thought the Kansas plains were too flat and too cold for civilized life. Virginia read the letter to Cecil at supper, and he listened with the attentive expression he brought to things Virginia considered important, and when she finished he said, "Your sister sounds like someone I would like." "You would," Virginia said. "She would also make you deeply tired within 4 days. She is a great deal of person." "I look forward to it," he said. Spring came, and with it the frame house, which went up in April with the help of a work party organized by Della Morrow, with the efficient community spirit of a woman who knew how things got done on the plains. 12 men from surrounding farms arrived on a Monday morning with their tools and their wives and children, and by Friday the frame was up, the roof was on, and the walls were beginning to take their final shape. Virginia fed everyone from a fire in the yard, cooking enough to sustain 12 working men for 5 days, which was a project of considerable logistical complexity that she managed with the same focused competence she brought to everything. Standing inside the unfinished house on the last evening of the work party, with the April wind coming in through the window openings and the last light golden on the raw wood floors, Virginia turned slowly and looked at the rooms, the kitchen with its generous windows to the east, the parlor, the bedroom, the pantry she had specified, and felt the particular emotion of a woman who has built a thing with her own hands and her own insistence, and is standing inside it for the first time. Cecil came and stood behind her, his hands on her shoulders, and they looked at it together. "It is good," he said. "It is very good," she said. They moved in when the plaster was dry and the floors were finished and the stove was set and the windows hung, and Virginia arranged the books on new shelves that Cecil had built along the parlor wall. The Bible, the Tennyson, the natural history volumes, the Dickinson, and a growing collection of additional titles they had accumulated through catalog orders, and the occasional book wagon that passed through Millard's Creek. Thomas's pencil drawings went up on the parlor wall, framed now in simple pine frames that Cecil had made, hung at the height that showed them best. She had been worried briefly that Cecil would find this strange, a wife's first husband's artwork hung in the house she shared with her second husband, but when she had raised the question he had looked at her with a mild puzzlement and said, "They are beautiful, and they are part of you. Why would I want them anywhere else?" That was the year they found out she was expecting. It was late summer, and Virginia had been aware of the signs for several weeks before she said anything, partly from the caution of a woman who had lost pregnancies before, and partly from a desire to hold the knowledge close for a while, to be certain of it herself before it became a shared fact. She told Cecil on an evening in August when they were sitting on the new porch. The house had a proper porch, the first one Virginia had ever had on a home she owned, watching the heat lightning flicker on the western horizon. She said it the way she said most important things, which was directly and without decoration. Cecil went very still. Then he turned to look at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, not the quiet care, not the thoughtful attention, but something larger and less composed, something that looked like a man seeing something he had wanted very much arriving all at once. "Virginia," he said. "I wanted to be sure first," she said. "I am sure." He reached out and took her hand in both of his. He held it with the gentle specificity of someone holding something that requires particular care. He did not say all the things that people said in such moments. He looked at her and held her hand, and the heat lightning moved across the western sky, and the Kansas night made its familiar sounds, and she thought that she was very glad she had not finished that thought at the fence post in the rain, a year and a summer ago. Very glad indeed. The baby was born in April of 1880, in the house with its plank floors and east-facing kitchen windows, with Della Morrow present as midwife and Cecil somewhere on the other side of the closed door doing, Virginia supposed, whatever men did when they were waiting for the most important thing to happen without them. The birth was hard and long, and Virginia was entirely equal to it, which surprised no one who knew her. And at the end of it she was holding a boy, a solid, emphatic boy with dark eyes that looked immediately and with great interest at everything around him, which Virginia took as a good sign. They named him Thomas Cecil Carver, because Virginia had wanted Thomas in his name, and Cecil had quietly agreed before she had finished suggesting it. And the middle name was her doing entirely, because she thought a son ought to carry his father's name somewhere on him. Cecil came in when Della called him, and he stood at the bedside and looked at his son, at Virginia, at the small dark-eyed child with an expression that Virginia would remember for the rest of her life, because it was the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not fully expect to arrive, who is standing in the middle of something that exceeds all his previous categories for good. "Thomas Cecil," she said. "Is that all right with you?" Cecil reached down and touched the baby's cheek with one careful finger. "It is perfect," he said. His voice was rougher than usual, which was the most outward sign of feeling she had ever observed in him, and she loved him for the restraint of it, and for what it was restraining in equal measure. Della Morrow stayed through the afternoon, and then rode home with the satisfied expression of a woman who has done good work, leaving behind a pot of soup and a long list of instructions that Virginia listened to with polite attention and planned to observe in the ways that seemed reasonable to her. They were alone then, the three of them, in the house as the April evening came on, the last light coming through the kitchen windows, Thomas Cecil asleep in the small wooden cradle that Cecil had made over the winter in the evenings after supper, working by lamplight with a concentration and a care that Virginia had watched with a feeling that was too full to fit into any single word she owned. Virginia sat in the parlor with the baby and looked at the books on the shelves and the pencil drawings on the wall and the new curtain she had made from blue cotton, the blue of those creek bottom wildflowers, the one Cecil had marked as remarkable, and she thought about all the increments and accidents and deliberate choices that had brought her to this particular evening in this particular room with this particular life arranged around her. She thought about the rain and the fence post and the unfinished thought. She thought about the sound of hooves on wet ground. She thought about a man on a dark roan horse asking for directions to a place he had taken a wrong turn from, and how everything afterward had followed from that single moment of turning to look, of saying the unexpected thing, of asking a stranger in out of the weather on an impulse she still could not fully account for except to say that the impulse had been exactly right. Thomas Cecil stirred in her arms and made the small sounds of a baby negotiating the strangeness of existence, and Virginia held him closer and looked up at Thomas's drawing of the creek-bottom willows on the parlor wall, and she said to it, quietly, the way you say things to someone who is not in the room, you would like him very much, both of them. Cecil came in from checking the animals, which he did every evening at this hour because the animals did not care about the significance of occasions. He hung up his coat and came to the parlor doorway and looked at Virginia and the baby, and then he came and sat beside her on the settle and put his arm around her, careful of the child, and she leaned into him and felt the solid warmth of him. The specific steady weight of his presence that she had come to understand was the thing she had been most in need of and had not known how to name. He looks like you, Cecil said, looking at the baby. He looks like himself, Virginia said. He is approximately 12 hours old. He has not yet decided who he looks like. He has your eyes, though, Cecil said, that particular sharpness. Sharp, Virginia said. Observant, Cecil said, correcting himself, and she could hear the smile in it without seeing his face. The particular look of someone who notices things. I will take that, Virginia said. The Kansas night settled around the house, and the April wind moved through the grass of the fields where the new wheat was already a few inches high in its rows, and the first stars appeared over the plains in the eastern sky. Everything was as it had been, and everything was different, the way things always are after the important moments. The same land, the same wind, the same enormous sky, and inside it all this house, this light, these three people who had found each other by a combination of loss and accident and choice, and the particular mercy of arriving at the right place at the right time. In the years that followed, Thomas Cecil grew into a boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's quiet thoughtfulness, and a loud, joyful energy all his own that neither parent could quite account for, which Della Morrow said was simply the personality of a child who felt entirely secure in his world and could therefore afford to be exuberant. Virginia agreed with this assessment, though she noted privately that the exuberance was going to require a certain amount of management once he was old enough to reach things on high shelves. A second child came in 1882, a girl they named Clara May Clara for Virginia's sister in Ohio, who had finally visited in the summer of 1881, and had, as Virginia had predicted, made everyone deeply tired within 4 days, while also being so thoroughly delightful that no one minded, and May for the month of the creek-bottom wildflowers. Clara May had Cecil's dark eyes and Virginia's auburn hair, and a temperament of serene practicality that suggested she had arrived knowing perfectly well what she was about. Clara from Ohio came again for the birth of Clara May and stayed 3 weeks, and offered opinions on Kansas soil, Kansas weather, Kansas cooking, and Kansas men with the comprehensive authority of someone who had spent approximately 12 days in the state, and everyone tolerated it with affection, because she was Clara, and because underneath the commentary she loved her sister with a fierceness that expressed itself in criticism, the way some people's love expressed itself in silence. Cecil expanded the farm operation over those years, with the steady incrementalism of a man who understood that good things were built in careful steps. He filed the full claim on the north 80 acres and brought it into cultivation, added a proper barn with a hay loft, and eventually installed a wind pump at the creek that eliminated the twice-daily bucket work that had been among the most laborious of the farm's tasks. Virginia kept the accounts, managed the household with the same efficient authority she had always brought to it, and continued to order books through the catalog with a regularity that Cecil had long since stopped pretending to question. Darnell Good died in the winter of 1881, and his cattle operation was taken over by a son who lived in Kansas City and had little interest in the particular piece of ground Virginia and Cecil held. The mortgage note, of course, had been paid years ago. Virginia folded the receipt, still crisp and clear in its tin box under what was now the parlor floor of the frame house. Every time she thought about it, which was less and less often as the years passed, and then one day she unfolded it and found that it felt like old history, like something from another version of her life, which was the best thing she could have hoped for it. The plum tree Thomas had planted in 1875 continued to give fruit every summer. Virginia still ate the plums standing in the small orchard, still experienced the particular satisfaction of a thing surviving and flowering past the hand that planted it. She had told Cecil the story of that tree early in their marriage, and now every summer he would come find her in the orchard in the plum season and eat one and say, "Still the best ones in the county," and she would agree, and they would stand there for a few minutes in the summer heat among the laden branches before going back to whatever work waited. Thomas Cecil Carver, growing up on the combined farm, spent his childhood in the company of the Kansas Plains, and the two people who had built their life there with such particular care and such full intention. He learned the wheat from his mother, the rows, the seasons, the language of soil, and the land itself from his father, the names and habits of every plant and bird and weather system, learned to read the sky the way some children learn to read books. He was a serious, curious boy who was also, in the evenings, given to running barefoot across the yard, catching fireflies in the late summer dark with Clara May behind him. And these two things seemed to Virginia to be the best possible combination. On a September evening in 1883, 5 years after she had stood in the rain at the northeast corner of her claim and almost resolved a thought in the wrong direction, Virginia Carver walked out to the fence post, which had been replaced twice since then and now stood straight and solid in fresh-packed earth, and stood where she had stood on that wet afternoon. The sky was clear and dry tonight, the first stars appearing, the last light pink on the western horizon. She looked at the boundary of her claim. 240 acres now, she and Cecil's combined. The frame house with its lit windows behind her, warm and specific against the dark. The sound of Thomas Cecil's voice carrying from inside where he was undoubtedly trying to convince Cecil to let him stay up past his usual hour. A negotiation that Cecil pretended to be strict about, and Virginia pretended not to notice him losing. She looked at the old post, which was new now but in the same spot, and she thought about the woman who had stood here before. Not so different from the woman standing here now. Really same hands, same eyes, same particular habit of looking at things straight on until she understood them. But different in the way that mattered, different in the specific, irreversible way that comes from 5 years of living rather than enduring. She heard the sound of footsteps on the dry grass and turned to find Cecil walking toward her across the yard, his long, familiar silhouette against the lit windows of the house. "Thomas Cecil has negotiated himself another half hour," he said, coming to stand beside her. "I have no idea how he does it." "He does it by being entirely reasonable," Virginia said. "He makes a very sensible argument and then you agree with it because it is sensible and then he wins. You should try being unreasonable." "I have never been able to manage it," Cecil said. They stood together at the fence post, looking out at the dark fields, the sky enormous above them, the stars thickening as the last light faded. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Virginia turned to look at his face in the darkness, the familiar angles of it, the dark eyes that had looked at her steadily for 5 years and still had the quality of paying full attention, of seeing her specifically rather than just generally. She reached out and took his hand, the way she had taken it on the fence rail on the first evening they had said the true thing to each other. "I was thinking," she said, "about the last time I stood here." He squeezed her hand. He knew the story. And, he said, and I am thinking how close I came to finishing that thought, she said, and how glad I am that I did not get the chance. Cecil was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark fields that were their life, the wheat stubble, the creek line, the barn, the house with its warm windows. So am I, he said. Virginia leaned into him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood at the edge of their claim in the September dark under the Kansas stars, and the wind moved through the grass as it always had and always would. And inside the house their daughter slept, and their son argued charmingly for a longer evening, and the plum tree stood in the orchard, invisible in the dark but there, bearing its particular witness to all the years and all the hands that had made this place. The thought that had begun on a rainy afternoon in 1878, the thought about leaving, about giving up, about the limits of what a woman alone could sustain, that thought had been interrupted before it could finish, and it had never finished, and it never would. In its place was everything else. In its place was this: the land, the house, the work of many seasons, a man who stood at a polite distance in the rain, and a woman who asked him in out of the weather, and all the long and particular and entirely unrepeatable life that had followed from those two simple facts. Virginia Carver stood at her fence post and looked at her world and knew it, fully and specifically, as her own. The stars came out over Kansas, one by one, and the night was very beautiful, and the wind smelled like autumn grain and the coming cold and the particular sweetness of the plains in the evening, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.